Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our last series of breakout sessions during NACD's 75th anniversary annual meeting. I know we're almost towards the end of this meeting and appreciate you joining NACD here today, as well as representatives of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, otherwise known as ESMC. Their session today is on enrollment specialist training. ESMC is a member-based organization launching a national-scale ecosystem services market for agriculture to recognize and reward farmers and ranchers for their environmental services to society. ESMC members represent the spectrum of the agriculture sector supply chain, with whom we are scaling sustainable agriculture sector outcomes, including increased soil carbon, reduced net greenhouse gases, and improved water quality and water use conservation. The two representatives joining us today, the first is Debbie Reed, who is the Executive Director of ESMC. Her role in leading ESMC builds on decades of experience in agricultural climate change mitigation and sustainability efforts at the national and international level. Debbie previously led the Coalition on Agriculture Greenhouse Gases, a national multi-stakeholder coalition supporting the development of tools, support systems, knowledge, and programs to improve quantification of greenhouse gases in agriculture. Our second speaker will be Benjamin Bartley, who leads ESMC's protocol adaptation and refinement work, including management of the protocols, assets, and program certification process. Benjamin has worked in food systems and sustainable agriculture throughout his career, from vending at farmers markets and processing livestock to working in cooperative extension and as a farm food safety auditor. Both Debbie and Ben are also on our session today and will be happy to answer any questions you have in the chat feature. So just shoot over a question during their presentation and they will be happy to get that answered. Really appreciate all of y'all for being here today. So I will turn it over to Debbie, and please again, send your questions through and appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, Coleman, for that introduction, and thanks to NACD for inviting us to do this presentation. So we are, what we want to do today, what we want to accomplish is actually go through our training program for ESMC Enrollment Specialists and get your feedback. We have developed this program specifically so that enrollment specialists who are knowledgeable about ESMC and our market can help enroll farmers and ranchers into the program and really improve their experience so that they understand everything that they need to do to participate in ESMC. So we will do a snapshot of the training program that we have established, and we're really looking for your feedback throughout this session. So at any point, please, in the chat box, put in questions that you would like us to answer or any thoughts that you might have on how we improve it. Does it make sense? Is it clear to you? Is there something outstanding that we could add to this to make it a more beneficial experience, both for training program, for training enrollment specialists, as well as for producers? So what we'll cover in this is I'll start with a high-level overview of the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, who we are, how we operate. Then we'll get into the role of the ESMC enrollment specialists, talk about producer eligibility and program requirements, so that the enrollment specialist can be clear and articulate this to producers, and walk you through what our online producer portal and the actual program enrollment process looks like. So we are a nonprofit organization operating as a public-private partnership, and our mission really is to be a change agent to advance ecosystem service markets that really incentivize farmers and ranchers to improve soil health systems that benefit society. Our initial focus was on soil health systems as the very basis of sustainable agricultural systems. We have taken on work that, as part of our market program, that goes above and beyond that, but with the central mission of improving soil health systems, because a lot of the sustainable outcomes and impacts from agriculture that society demands and that we're seeking to scale are in fact tied to soil health systems. We are also, we started this actual organization in 2017 and have been doing a lot of due diligence to create a market that is both conceived and specifically designed for agriculture. And we started by assessing both current and previous markets and really tried to design a market that will overcome what we saw and have identified as true market challenges, both from the supply side, if you will, the farmer rancher side, but also from the buyer side as well as project developers. So we really tried to just reimagine what ecosystem service markets need to look like to successfully scale and engage farmers and ranchers at scale. Because we know that unless we can engage farmers and ranchers, we won't have a viable market. At the very basis of what we're doing, we are recognizing and rewarding farmers and ranchers for what they do and for new impacts that we as society, as corporates, as buyers are demanding from them. So not just rewarding them financially, but doing a good job of recognizing all that farmers and ranchers do to fulfill both societal obligations and commitments, but buyer demand as well. This slide shows you our current funders who have been working with ESMC, as well as our research arm, the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. We'd really just like to thank all of these funders for working with us and providing financial support and other support to ensure that we're successful. The next slide shows our current membership. And as you see, we have membership from across the entire agricultural supply chain and value chain. One of the things that we have determined is that to create a successful market for agriculture, it is important that we build it and build it with the buy-in and participation of the entire agricultural supply chain and value chain to overcome a lot of those market challenges that we've seen in the past. And this includes everything from developing protocols collaboratively in a pre-competitive space with this group of members, but also kicking the tires on the entire program through pilot projects, working through investments collaboratively in new tools and technologies to help really drop the cost of developing a national scale program that is scalable and cost effective, and again, overcomes those challenges we've seen in the past. So our thanks to all of these members you see on this slide. And of course, NACD is one of those very important partners who we see as what we will call either a channel partner or a partner who can really work with us on the landscape to scale conservation and sustainable outcomes and help us to enroll farmers and ranchers. One of the things we are often asked is how we differ from other markets or market-based approaches, and what is our value proposition? So in other words, how are we different? One thing is we're a nonprofit. We're really just in this game to ensure successful scaling of beneficial outcomes and rewarding farmers and ranchers for these outcomes that, again, corporates and others are demanding. We are also operating as a collaborative with the entire ag supply chain and value chain, as I indicated, in a pre-competitive space so that we can meet the needs of buyers, of sellers, of conservation NGOs and organizations such as NACD to ensure that our common goals and objectives are met in a way that meets everyone's goals and commitments. One of the things that members' dues pay for is co-investing in our research and development. And to date, we've been investing more than $22 million in technologically advanced quantification approaches, verification approaches, satellite imagery, new tools and technologies that will really help us build a market that is scalable, that is cost effective, and that really reduces the burden and any onerous demands on farmers and ranchers in particular. Our entire program, our protocols are science-based, they're systems-based, and we are practice agnostic. We come from the point of view that agriculture operates as a system, and every operator operates and manages a system. So we are practice agnostic, and what we really try to look at is when a producer and farmer and rancher enrolls, what is the starting point at which they enroll, and what changes and beneficial impacts occur over time that we can quantify. And so we're outcomes based, and we're literally paying for performance and tracking it at the level of the producer and their fields and farms, so that the level of effort produced by the farmer and rancher will be commensurate with their ability to generate credits or assets and then be paid. We are also unique in that we have an integrated program that does two things: generates credits for multiple markets. We operate in 2 markets right now, one being what we call the Scope 1 carbon offset and compliance grade water quality and water quantity market, and the other being Scope 3, or helping corporates who have agriculture as a large part of their indirect emissions meet their commitments and obligations to reduce their greenhouse gas and other environmental footprints from their agricultural purchases. The other thing we do is we have protocols that generate multiple assets or credits that we stack and then pay producers for, representing right now soil carbon, net greenhouse gases, water quality, and water use conservation. So producers enroll, go through one process. We can quantify 4 assets or credits and then stack them and pay them for those multiple outcomes. The last thing that is unique is that we cover both croplands, rangelands, and livestock systems. And the way we are operating is to system by system, if you will, work across every major region of the United States and ensure that we can incorporate all major agricultural production systems in those regions to, again, scale outcomes and impacts across the country. Our tiered modular protocol design, this is a nice little slide in that it shows 2 things. One is those 2 markets I indicated we sell into. One is Scope 1, you see at the top, in which we can generate greenhouse gas and soil organic carbon net greenhouse gas credits. That refers to both removals and reductions that are stacked together. And then compliance grade water quality offsets that cover phosphorus reductions, nitrogen, and sediment reductions in water bodies. In the Scope 3 market, which is on the bottom half of the slide, we generate 3 credits currently: greenhouse gases and soil organic carbon, both separately and together, as well as water quality credits that look the same in terms of what is covered as what is included in Scope 1, and then water quantity or water use efficiency credits. And we have launched work to develop a biodiversity credit for Scope 3 supply chain reporting because of member demand and a real desire from corporates to be able to track their impacts on biodiversity in operations from which they purchase a product. In terms of our benefits to farmers and ranchers, we, again, we pay based on results and not practices, so that the payments will be commensurate with the level of effort that any one producer will apply to their operations. We're also a one-stop shop for meeting buyer demands, not only for multiple assets, but again, in multiple markets. So when a farmer or rancher enrolls, they will enroll in one of the 2 markets, but can enroll different lands in both of those markets. To also ease burden of data entry, we are working to ensure that any data platforms producers are already working with, and we know there are a lot of proprietary data management platforms that producers utilize, can just import data from those platforms into ours so that there are no redundancies in terms of data collection. Another important benefit is that we feel it is imperative that producers own and have full access to data that is collected as part of their participation, and that we share the quantified environmental outcomes, not just in the form of credits that they get paid for, but so they can see on a total farm and ranch basis or per acre basis what their impacts are on a year-to-year basis. We also ensure that members are equipped with agronomic and technical support, if you will, to enable systems transitions, because we know that technical assistance is place specific, it's location specific, and it is specific to the particular individual operations and management systems that farmers and ranchers are already engaging. So there's no one size fits all approach here. And we know that the requisite agronomic support is necessary to really bring producers through these transitions. And then the last thing I'll say is, while we're quantifying the assets that I referenced, we do know that improvements in soil health provide co-benefits beyond what we are measuring. For instance, reduced inputs, increased productivity, fertility, et cetera, that come with soil health, reduced erosion to wind and water, et cetera. So there's a whole suite of benefits that are accrued above and beyond the generation of credits or assets that can be sold, that farmers and ranchers can be paid for. And we hope to track all of those over time. This slide really just gives a very high level overview of how our market functions. So the first thing that happens, and what is really the benefit or the focus, if you will, of this particular session, is that producer enrollment process. It's not a complicated process, but we want to ensure that when a member enrolls, they understand all of the roles and obligations, both when they enroll, but over time. Once all of their data is entered into our portal, we will quantify all of the assets and credits. That is one of the investments we have been making in tools and technologies and the platform to take that role and that burden off either farmers or ranchers or buyers. The next thing that we do is ensure that any assets created are in fact verified and then certified. And once they're generated and listed, if you will, they are sold so that producers can be paid from the actual purchase, if you will, of those credits by buyers within our market. This slide shows two things. One, the stars show where we have pilot projects that we have launched and are operating right now. As you can see, they are in major regions of the country, particularly in the central portion of the country. The second thing that this slide shows is the colored regions show where we have already adapted our protocols, calibrated and validated our quantification tools for the assets we are offering, so that anywhere that you see a colored region, if you will, is a region we can operate in and launch pilots. We are going stepwise. This shows where we're operating now. We're going stepwise, and we will ultimately be covering the entire country. But this is where we're operating right now in pilots and able to launch new pilots. I'll turn it over now to Benjamin, who will give you an overview of ESMC Enrollment Specialists.
All right, hello all. Thank you, Debbie, for that overview of ESMC. And as you mentioned, I'm going to be kind of covering the rest of the content for today's presentation, beginning with this overview of really what the role of ESMC Enrollment Specialist is. And I'll reiterate again, we very much want engagement from this audience in particular, because as you just saw with the previous slide and what we've described through the piloting process is we're really road testing this market program, making sure that it works so that in preparation for our full market launch in 2022, this is as streamlined as possible. And enrollment specialists play an important role in that. So we are in the process of building out training for enrollment specialists, and some of our members like NACD could very well play a key role in that process, kind of what we highlighted as that first step in the workflow and 2 slides ago, beginning with producer enrollment. So as we kind of lay out here, the 2 main functions of ESMC Enrollment Specialist is 1, assisting producers with enrollment in the program. To be sure, farmers and ranchers will be able to self-enroll, but ESMC members, if you remember back to that slide of all of our founding, all of our members, NACD being one of them, Some of our members will play kind of a boots on the ground role in this and other ways, but NACD and other technical service providers are well equipped to potentially add this as a function to your engagement with your stakeholders. So in addition to assisting producers with the actual enrollment process, kind of their complementary role is helping them to understand program requirements, eligibility, and expectations of ESMC program participation. Why be trained as an enrollment specialist? One, it provides another point of engagement with producers. And that might be a point of engagement of interest to producers because participation in this program helps them to generate an additional or supplemental revenue stream for their businesses. And, I say supplemental here because they can, both be enrolled in some conservation programs like EQUIP or CRP and still be able to participate in ecosystem services markets like ours. Stacking as many payment methods as possible to really incentivize. What I've highlighted here as the third kind of reason is incentivizing our shared interest and advancing the shared interests of producers adopting new and more conservation practices. So if that's the main role of enrollment specialists, the knowledge base then, and what folks likely need to understand is what you see here. And this is kind of our list in anticipation of what questions we think producers will have at this stage in the process, partly informed by what we've already fielded to date through our pilots. And that's what we foresee enrollment specialists needing to understand. To the degree possible, many of these questions will have answers on our website's FAQ, and we're going to have an enrollment specialist training manual. That will be like a beefed up version of the FAQs to serve as a resource document to enrollment specialists. It's not our expectation that an enrollment specialist has all the answers, but kind of being the point of first engagement, these are the types of questions that we know and anticipate producers will anticipate. And again, I'll note that part of what we really want out of today's session is gathering what you all think you'll need to know in order to potentially serve this role, and even turning the tables a bit, like if you can think of some things that we at ESMC need to consider as we continue building out this function of enrollment specialists, please include that in the chat box as well. Who can be an enrollment specialist? I will say and lead with the fact that trained enrollment specialists do not need to be agronomic technical service providers. That being said, having the skill set, and why we're really enthused to be presenting here with this audience, is that being a technical service provider is a value add to producers. So being kind of a dual TSP and enrollment specialist, is value add because not only can you help them with the process, but you are, by virtue of your everyday role, able to also identify opportunities for new conservation practice adoption. And in the likely interest of the producers, finding ways to help optimize the outcomes that we're all wanting to see, improvements in soil health, soil carbon sequestered, greenhouse gas reductions, water quality improvements, etc. I will note, because we will see this here shortly when we talk more about the process, is that there's kind of multiple roles and functions. There's the enrollment specialist, but you'll also see here during the enrollment process that there's also a producer advisor or producer designees. And there are some distinctions. I'll kind of illustrate that a little bit here with the next slide. And advisors, there's differences, but also some similarities. The Venn diagram where these functions and roles can potentially overlap. With you in this audience, I'm really going to focus on the producer enrollment piece, but I'm going to highlight the fact that part of ESMC's membership is also ag retailers, CCAs, and some of those entities and advisors might be more equipped to play these other roles of either a producer advisor or a designee based on kind of the nature of their relationship with the producer. But at the end of the day, kind of it's going to be case by case, and it's really dependent on the nature of you all and your relationship with the producers. This is one of our attempts to kind of describe what this Venn diagram or where the overlap may happen. And I'm doing it, overlaying it with what kind of the process looks like for 1 year's worth of activity with the producer, kind of beginning with enrollment all the way through to submission of management data, as you see here in the middle, the finalized data, sign contract and submit, which is then followed by what Debbie was previously talking about then the modeling and the actual quantification of the assets, the verification, the asset generation. We're really focused on kind of the left hand of this entire timeline, and with the primary role of enrollment specialists being on the front end of this process. Another way to think about this is producer recruitment in a way, getting them familiarized with the program, the eligibility requirements, the expectations, actually into our producer portal, identifying which fields they want to enroll, and the initial soil sampling based on the project boundaries of the fields they enroll. That's a big bulk of what enrollment specialists and what today's kind of overview of the training is going to touch on. But I will note that the actual uploading of management data all the way to that finalization and submission of data, that may be the producer, their advisor, their designee. And if the nature of the relationship makes sense with the producer, those could be functions also done by the enrollment specialist. So that's kind of the what an enrollment specialist is. And as mentioned, the questions we anticipate, one big role that they'll play with producers is kind of answering some of their questions, doing their pre-screenings and helping them to understand, is this the right program for them? So I'm going to pivot now and talk a little bit more about producer eligibility and general ESMC program requirements. These are not exhaustive, but I'm going to highlight some of the big ones that we find come up frequently with our members and producers, beginning with one. When enrolling with the program, we are looking for the implementation of a new practice. I note this too, though, that at the same time, while we're looking for the implementation of a new practice, ESMC is actively exploring opportunities for recognizing and still rewarding producers that we're calling here as early adopters. Folks who have been doing conservation practices for some time. We're actively exploring ways, both with buyers and these organizations that literally set the standards for how to quantify, verify, and certify these outcomes, trying to find a way to allow for these early adopters to participate as well. But one main question, and something that's probably resonates with this audience, is producers who are implementing a new conservation practice are definitely more easily aligned and able to assess their eligibility. The second bullet point is a very important one, and a very important principle in carbon markets and ecosystem service markets, and that's the fact that we don't want to double count them. And a really tangible way of what that can look like is ensuring that we're not enrolling the same acres of land in different and multiple ecosystem service markets for the same outcomes. And I have an example here, for instance, of if I'm a producer, I have some of my acreage enrolled in indigo, that's another ecosystem service market, and I'm getting my carbon and greenhouse gases quantified with them. I cannot enroll that same land with ESMC and have the same quantification. That would be double counting the same outcomes and kind of going against the integrity of these markets. So that's a really important program requirement and something to assess up front. Third bullet, demonstration of ownership of these outcomes. They are somewhat intangible ideas, but they're being sold, and they are therefore needing to have an owner, the producer. And what ESMC is really created to do is make sure that the producer is the beneficiary and the owner of this asset. Demonstration of that ownership is simplest when the land being enrolled is actually owned by the producer. That's not often the case, as we know. So when land is leased, we do require some sort of written agreement with the landowner. ESMC will have templates for potential written acknowledgement or contracts that producers can use with their if they're tenants. And that can be done not immediately on the front end if necessary, but it is something that we want to call out here and know that is a frequent question for producers when they're assessing whether or not they want to enroll in a program like ESMC. I'm going to touch on two more kind of producer eligibility or program requirements, kind of going back to practices, and not only the implementation of new ones, but that they must be, quote, additional. They must be, additional in multiple senses. One, that they're beyond a regulatory requirement, for instance. But also kind of tying into the second principle in the quotation marks of the prevailing practice for a region, they must not be what's already happening on the majority of acres. The prevailing practice for a region is what is practiced by the majority of folks. And the region is oftentimes county. It could be crop reporting district, or actually actively trying to determine that within our program what the right scale is. But suffice it to say, if conservation tillage, for example, one of the practices we'll recognize, if that's already being practiced by more than 50%, on more than 50% of the acres in the region in which a producer is trying to enroll, that's no longer additional. It's already common practice. That's not applicable, though, for all of the environmental attributes and scopes Debbie talked about earlier. We have multiple markets a producer can enroll in, scope 1 versus 3, and there's multiple environmental attributes, water quality in addition to greenhouse gases and carbons, for instance. So if there's a point to be made here, it's somewhat complicated. And when this training manual is complete, for example, we'll have a table. We'll have it very clearly laid out what the ideas of additionality and prevailing practice will mean during the enrollment process. But as the topic that we want to introduce, that's why we're including it here, because it's always a question that we field at this point in the kind of producer enrollment process. And then lastly, I've kind of alluded to a 2022 ESMC market launch. And even on that pilot project map we saw earlier with the colored regions where we're currently active, where our models are already calibrated and validated, those major production systems that we've really prioritized. At market launch, we will have parts of the United States, parts of our geographies ready to go, and likely some others that we're still working to develop. So that's part of what eligibility will necessitate. Are the producers in a region that we're ready to do the quantification that really is the main function ESMC serves on the back end. In a similar way, yes, we're practice agnostic, but our models do necessitate kind of identification of the different conservation practices that result in the outcomes we're looking at. So I just use as an example here, like at that market launch, we need to ensure that yes, the producer is using an eligible practice for our models at that point, which is likely to include tillage, cover crops, crop rotations, buffer strips, a whole host of practices that are scientifically validated to result in the outcomes we want, oftentimes aligned with NRCES conservation practice standards, so that the practices align with what the producer's doing and that the producer's aligned in one of the regions that we're active in. I call out the Great Plains, the Soy and Corn Belt, Pacific Northwest here, for example, but that will all be well published and known come market launch. And then on the front end too, producers always have questions about agreements and what it is that they're signing up for. What are the terms and conditions? So a few high-level points here to note is that, for one, contract periods are generally 10 years and can be renewed once for a total of 20 years. We'll go into some nuances here, and you can literally see it in the second bullet, in the sense that depending on which market they're in, which scope, the 10-year contract period is kind of a reflection of multiple things. One, the time lengths involved for some of the assets we're quantifying. Soil carbon takes some time to accrue, for instance. So we think about it in 10-year times, but that's not said and done. Scope 3, for instance, is an annual, is really assessed annually. So if producers, for whatever reason, need to pull out of a contract early, that should be okay in most instances. Really, it's more the maximum of 20 years that we're highlighting here, since at some point too, some of these benefits begin to plateau and soil carbon begins to reach its natural saturation point, for instance. But that's one question we field frequently. In terms of the outcomes and the models, they are calculated annually. Payments will depend on scope. As I mentioned, scope 3 for the corporate sustainability reporting, that's annual, and thus payments are annual. The scope 1 markets for soil carbon in particular, since it takes some time for that to accrue, those are usually every 5 years. So that's something that producers, they want to know when they can expect a check. It's not so much an element or an answer necessary on our end to assess producer eligibility, but it's something that if enrollment specialists are helping producers to navigate the space, they'll need to be prepared in some way to kind of address questions like this, like when can I expect to be paid? Another point, there's no contractual volume of outcomes producers are required to meet. As we mentioned before, this is based on performance. The more conservation practices, the more effort put into this, the more actual outcomes result, and the more payments happen. They don't need to hit some benchmark, for instance, in order to be rewarded. And there's also no enrollment fee, or like some other markets, requirements to purchase agricultural products by participating. We're practice agnostic again. Some of these conservation practices don't require new inputs or the purchase of new products. They just require new rotations or other interventions. So, in a similar vein to payments, what is it going to cost me? I'm sure is a question that many folks will field. And for whatever it's worth, we like to lead with the fact that there's no enrollment fee. This first point, we're going to go through and literally have some screenshots of what the producer portal and actually going through the enrollment process looks like. So I just call out here that, in order to participate, producers have to create an account, enter required information, and ultimately self-certify that the information they put in there is accurate to the best of their knowledge. Also already mentioned is that demonstrated ownership of the assets. And in the same theme of costs, there's no cost to enrolling in ESMC's program, right? But some of these practices will entail implementation costs. If I'm going to introduce cover crop, that seed is going to be a cost incurred by the producer. So hopefully we can, stack some of these programs, maybe get some public funds to help cover some of these conservation practices that will further incentivize producers to do this. But that's something that ESMC is not involved with. We're all about rewarding producers for the outcomes. There are some potential program expenses too that producers, depending on their scenario, may be responsible for. And really the big one is soil sampling on the front end at enrollment. Once we have our field boundaries in, and we can stratify those fields to do soil sampling and get that baseline. What is their soil carbon at point of enrollment so we can track change over time? Unless they have those costs covered by a project sponsor of some sort, that is similarly a producer expense. So that's something to be transparent about, communicate on the front end, and there'll be a lot more information on that front that we can provide, when we get to that crossroads. Because, for instance, that pilot project map you saw earlier, those are all by virtue of project sponsors, many of whom are themselves fundraising for the soil sampling costs. So much of what we're talking about today is really thinking about, in the future, 2022 ESMC market launch, what will that look like at that point as it relates to enrollment, as it relates to the questions enrollment specialists will have, and thus that's why we're kind of conceiving of it from that perspective. So that's kind of the what enrollment specialists are, what program eligibility can look like. So I want to spend most of the rest of today kind of showing some screenshots and kind of making more real what this process looks like from both a producer standpoint and from the enrollment specialist standpoint. So we have our online ESMC Producer Portal. This is where accounts will be made, where field boundaries will be established, where management data information will be entered, or to our earlier point about working with third-party platforms, producers can, connect their account with a third-party platform and kind of pull data from that to reduce the burden. But it's all happening online, and yeah, streamlined to make sure that it is as easy as possible. Some of those past market failures Debbie alluded to is just the fact that no one really likes doing this kind of work of data entry. That alone is a barrier to producers who have already so much going on just to make their businesses work. So what you're going to be seeing here today is kind of where that platform is today. Also with the caveat that kind of the user interfaces are actively being updated in part by what we're learning from our pilots and how we can make these modules more seamless. But yeah, that's what the rest of today's presentation is going to focus on, trying to put some meat to the kind of skeletal bones or process that you kind of see from nuts to bolts here in terms of kind of enrollment through field selection, data entry, and then finally the data submission. And this is kind of a narrative form of what you saw earlier from that sample timeline from, again, enrollment, field selection, kind of uploading of the data, and where enrollment specialists can play a role. So kind of the first steps, somewhat administrative, but it begins like many things do with setting up an account, of entering your producer name and contact info. On the front end, we have available our producer participation agreement for review. So producers know what they're signing up for, what the expectations are of them, what ESMC's responsibilities are too. We have, terms and conditions, and that includes a data privacy policy that we're going to talk about, because that's always of interest to producers. The actual submission of their application for an account, the activation of it, and I've highlighted here kind of that point of entry where an enrollment specialist may play a role. The point at which a producer is going to assign some privilege to another entity, in this case an enrollment specialist, to have access to their kind of joint access to their account, and some privileges, namely editing permissions. So an account's created, that's kind of the first step in enrollment. Then we're saying, well, field selection. Let's actually identify the bounds of the acres to be enrolled so that we can move on to step 8, field stratification. That soil sampling we referenced, that's important on to establish the starting stocks for soil organic carbon. Followed then by data entry, the management information and inputs that really drive our models. We are using DNDC as one model to quantify the greenhouse gas and soil organic carbon outcomes. We have another model, Apex, that quantifies the water quality outputs, and everything related to that data entry 9, 10 reflects the kind of site-specific management information necessary to get that scientific, rigorous estimation of the outcomes resulting from those interventions or those activities by the producer. Followed by that last kind of data submission. The producer or someone with the appropriate rights, we're calling that designee status here, someone uploads and self-certifies that the data entered is accurate, virtually signing the producer agreement and executing it. That same producer agreement kind of available to producers early on in the process up there in step 2, and that we'll see here shortly. And submitting that information by the end of the calendar year so that the modelers have what they need, in addition to other environmental conditions like the actual weather from the year to do what they do in quantifying the assets. So that's the producer portal enrollment steps kind of from start to finish, which I'll now kind of share some screenshots to bring to life. And as an enrollment specialist, producers, they can create this themselves. It might be if you're on site doing work with a producer for your day-to-day work, that like helping them go through this process side by side is something you assist them assist them with as well. Maybe you come in later at that step 6 when they just grant you access, but at least from that, what does an account setup look like? This is a screenshot of that information that we capture: first, last name, address. The typical, I think, for most anything we sign up for online these days. Submit the information, brings you to step 2. It's kind of selecting the project and reviewing or getting a preview of what that producer agreement is. This screenshot really represents where ESMC is at today with our pilot projects from that map earlier. And that's kind of where all of our producers participating in our program to date are funneled. We have these existing pilots, and therefore, when we're doing producer recruitment, we assign them to one of these projects. It won't look exactly this way come 2022 market launch, in part because by that time, we'll have much bigger projects, more geographic span. But the purpose is very similar. It's going to funnel producers to the right kind of market or scope, or literally sponsored project. Some of our other ESMC members, like Truterra, we have Corteva as a member, we have General Mills. Some of these entities have their own programs which producers are already enrolled with. And that this is simply a way for them to quantify and add value to their existing relationship with some of our project sponsors. In short, though, this early step is meant to funnel producers to where they need to be. And not yet here, but something we'll probably add in is some of these very simple eligibility checks. Based on even the first step we saw in terms of where the producers are at, if they enter an address that's not in one of our protocol regions we're ready for, we're going to save everybody time and make sure that we make a note that not quite eligible for the program because we're not there yet. This will serve a similar function in that we want to make sure we screen out folks for which there's actually not yet a place for them in the program, and assigning them to the right place where they are eligible. The little call out to the right there, very hard to see, that's the fine print because literally by size, but also what it is. It's the producer participation agreement. So that's something not needing to be signed by the producer at this early stage, but something available to them so that they know what it is they're signing up for. Step 3 would be terms and conditions. So in finalizing and yes, creating this account, producers are also signing multiple things. Beginning one, what you can see here as one of the top items for the terms and conditions is the privacy policy. We are having them sign up on some things at this early stage, and really data privacy is an important element to all this because this is something producers highly value. We get many questions on this front, and we make very clear that all the data that we're deriving from this quantification process is owned by the producer. There's some research elements. Debbie referenced ESMC and ESMRC. A big part of what ESMC does as a nonprofit is research. So during these pilot phases, we are conducting research and trying to answer questions to make this process more accurate, scientifically rigorous, et cetera. So that's one thing at this stage that producers are signing up for, that some of the data is being used for pilot purposes, but it is being aggregated, anonymized, and reported on, not a field scale and not associated with an individual in a field or otherwise. So that's all spelled out in the privacy policy. Similar data usage agreement. You'll see in the next slide, I think, there's lots of folks who kind of work on the back end of this producer portal and might have different lines of sight or access to data, but that's all very role dependent. And it's only done after all of these partners, contractors, subcontractors sign this data use agreement. They're bound by these privacy policies as well. It is only used for the purposes explicitly stated. I'm not going to read or go into this in much detail. I think the really purpose, what we're showing here is that the roles, what you see there on the left, from the producer to the enrollment specialist or advisor with explicit permission, to different ESMC staff, to the modelers I've referenced. all of these folks have a function in one way or another in getting those assets generated and quantified. And that they have different data use and access accordingly. This will be part of that training manual, that folks can reference if need be, if producers are really wanting to have specifics about who has access to what. But suffice it to say that it's as a nonprofit, as this consortium that's really trying to center the farmers' needs and perspectives in our market design. The intent with our data use and access is to make sure that the producers own the data at the end of the day. It's not being sold, it's not being used for purposes other than those advancing the nonprofit's mission and necessary to get the producers rewarded for their outcomes. So we've entered our info, we've been funneled to the right project, have agreed to the terms and conditions. We're just submitting and making sure like, yes, I'm a real person with a real email. And that's important because, the producer at the end of the day, getting an account activated with a live email that they use is really important because, these assets, they need to go to the person who owns them. And the person who owns them, they're ultimately responsible for all those data inputs and the self-certification, the agreements. So that's, if it seems a little administrative, it is, but it's because it's really important that the producer at the end of the day, is fully, consenting, aware of, and has the ability to grant access to the people they might want to assist with it, but, that we are in fact working with the producer. So this is that step 6, an optional component of like, all right, if I'm a producer and I'm enrolled, I have this producer portal access now. Now I can grant access to other users as need be. So for them, they would just be going to kind of that users section there at the top right, kind of inviting a user by entering their name and email address of an enrollment specialist they want to work with, their technical service provider that maybe made them aware of this program to begin with, and like maybe is also going to help them enroll and enter some of their data based on their familiarity with the producer's operation. But they would be able to grant access by kind of this function, clicking the users, inviting them. Enrollment specialists who are already enrolled, and assisting other producers, there'll be like a drop-down option so that you can pre-select them if they're already there. But that's essentially what step 6 is the time at which producers can bring in other parties, whether it's an enrollment specialist, an advisor, etc. So you're in, you're ready to kind of begin the process, and this one-time process, or at least one time as far as well, it's iterative in the sense that you can enroll additional acres down the road if you so choose and really like what you're doing. But one time in the sense that once a field is in, you don't have to do that again every year. And adding fields is something that enrollment specialists can certainly help with. It's fairly simple and kind of uses the kind of technologies we're increasingly familiar with, Google Maps like interface here. So I would be able to click this red button of add a field, and then pre-populated with what you're seeing here in the blue as kind of the boundaries from FSA demarcations. I think the most recent is their 2008 year boundaries, but like that would be pre-populated. So I'd be able to say, okay, that's my field right there, which I've clicked on, you can see in orange, for instance. Or like, oh no, the FSA boundaries aren't exactly right. There's a way for me to make kind of my own polygon and customized boundaries. Maybe the FSA boundary is out of date, or maybe it includes part of a field that I manage differently. I want to exclude, has land in it that I don't actually cultivate, etc. But getting these field boundaries kind of in, saved, and repeated as necessary is an important enrollment step, because those boundaries are where then all of the quantification pivots around. In addition to the step I've referenced of soil sampling, what fields are ultimately enrolled through this program, they're going to be sent off, stratified, so that kind of soil samplers ESMC is going to have bulk contracts with to really reduce the cost. They'll have a soil sampling plan to establish what those initial SOC stocks are, soil organic carbon stocks are. There's nothing that an enrollment specialist has to do at this point, so I don't talk about it much in this presentation. It's largely outside the scope of this presentation, but I note it here because it's a function of the kind of producer experience and process. And for whatever it's worth, it's outside the scope of this presentation. It's its own training, so whatever approved third-party soil samplers we work with they're approved by virtue of them going through a separate process. But one of our pilots, for instance, the soil sampling was performed by NRCS staffers. This is, I raise it here only because as technical service providers, maybe that's a point of engagement that makes sense with you and your producers as well. But for the purposes of what we're covering today, not really an enrollment specialist function. So your field boundaries are established. The soil samplers that are authorized through ESMC have a soil sampling plan, logistics with the producer to make sure they don't get surprised by someone showing up on their farm would obviously be coordinated. But that step being done, it's really about that producer management information. And this is kind of where enrollment specialist functions may end, or maybe you assist with this as well. We're going to show what that looks like here today because I want to give people a sense of the entire process. But this is what really drives those models. What is actually happening in the fields within the control of the producer, supplemented by the environmental factors like climate, et cetera, that's also gathered through remote sensing and the like. But this adding of kind of your cropland and your ranch land data is really important. And simply put, is kind of split into two different categories: reusable data or field or year-specific data. It's kind of similar to the fields where once they're in, they can kind of a one-time process and done. Some of this management data, once it's in, it's part of a program, and I can kind of like apply it to different fields this year, or be able to access it in future years and say, yeah, that program's going to be applied here. That kind of data, we make sure to differentiate to reduce the burden on the producer. Screenshot on the right here is again kind of capturing the kinds of information we're looking for, by fields, like selecting the crops, the specific planting details. Cover crops, if used, are important. And when we're talking about soil organic carbon as well, it's like how much residue is left, how much is incorporated into the soil afterwards. That's some of the inputs that you'll see here on the right, some of which we'll be able to pull from a third-party platform if producers are working with another entity that we can create an API and pull from. But this is some of that information needed, just to give you a flavor of what that looks like. Programs I just mentioned are an element to this as well. Here's an example of like fertilizers and field work. These are some things that if I'm a producer and I have this plan, maybe I built it in coordination with one of my technical service providers, and thus if this audience is going to be a potential enrollment specialist, a body of enrollment specialists, this may be where you do have some knowledge or be able to work with producers on. But selecting the program or manage operations is important here, and I think I'm going to like call out just from a user interface experience, like, all right, well, when I'm going to talk about my tillage program, you'll see another prompt like this, for instance, where you'll be able to select all that apply and collect things like types of tillage passes, the dates they occur, et cetera. The kind of front end enrollment and recruitment that I've described as the primary work of enrollment specialists, the back end work of kind of the advisor, the producer, et cetera, of like the management related data that we're looking at here. In some ways, both parties can do the others if trained and given permission by the producer. But we think about it as front end and back end in part because some of this management operations information, yes, you can put them in at the beginning of the season because that's your plan. But in some ways, we're fine with this being entered later in the process, ideally after some of these operations have been performed to really ensure their accuracy. Similar to stratification, this is one of the steps, so I talk about it here even though it's outside the scope. of what an enrollment specialist would do. Similarly, ESMC is working with bulk contracts with approved third-party soil analysis laboratories. So once those soil samples are collected, sent to an approved laboratory, they will be able to just upload their results directly to the portal. So it's an important step, one that the enrollment specialist and producer doesn't really need to have action to make happen, but I want to note it here. And around the whole data privacy question too, soil sampling results, that's maybe one of the value proposition of producers participating. They want to know more of these soil health indicators. So to be sure, these soil sampling results will be available to producers on in their portal on a field level. And then kind of capping all of this, what needs to happen before that December 31st timeline? It's that producer or, an ESMC enrollment specialist or an advisor with kind of the given permissions of a producer designee. Someone needs to complete the data and the self-certification that, yes, the data entered is to the best of my knowledge. That's why that account validation is so important, because in most cases, producers will likely be self-certifying, but we want to make sure that, yes, I'm signing off on the data as presented. At that same step too, signing that producer agreement that they had access to very early on, uploading the data and saying, yes, I'm agreeing to the terms of this agreement in so doing, and submitting that information then so that the work of quantifying the assets can then be done. Same slide we saw earlier. I'm just presenting it again as kind of a recap of that enrollment to field selection, data entry, and submission. Similar recap in the sense of the same narrative, but in kind of picture form left to right, with the enrollment specialist really playing kind of that front end role of helping producers get into the producer portal. And even before that, helping them understand ESMC, ecosystem service markets, why this might work for them, what conservation practices make sense in which fields I'm going to enroll, et cetera. So that process, with a lot of the front end work being kind of what our training for enrollment specialists will help to support, followed by the work of uploading the data, maybe to be done with an enrollment specialist, maybe with the producer or their advisor designee, all to be done before that December 31st timeline so that they can get paid for that year's activities accordingly. We hopefully, this is a recording, but in real time have been kind of typing answers to your questions as they come up, but I'm kind of recapping this presentation too with our intention and hopes for today's presentation. It's like, yes, we wanted to give a snapshot of what this training program and what enrollment specialists, their role is and what it looks like. But as kind of key stakeholders in all this, as technical service providers who are on the front lines, and if this makes sense to incorporate into kind of your point of engagement with producers, we need feedback on what we're envisioning as the training areas that will set you up for success. And to that end, I hope we're still chatting, and you can, if now that we've gone through it all, let us know. Was anything unclear presented? Knowing, yes, this was high level, but like what areas, if you're new to ecosystem services, where do we need to really bolster your knowledge? Or if you're more familiar, but in a more technical area, like what do we need to make sure has more meat to it? In a similar way, what else would you need to be effective in this role? We'll have our FAQs. We're going to have a lot of this documented, but putting on just your hat as like an adult educator or someone who does the work of technical service provision, like what do you need in order for you to be effective in this potential role? And also just from a practical standpoint, like, as nonprofits to nonprofits, like we're all wearing a lot of hats. This is in some ways another role to take on. So like, how might this role complement or interact with your existing day-to-day? Is this value add to you? Is this going to help, your conservation district's work, on a producer level, on, a portfolio level? How does this land with you? Like, we're very much wanting and trying to solicit feedback on, how our on the ground partners understand and see this as potentially complementing their work. Which is one reason we're really thankful for NACD's membership in ESMC along with other similar service providers, and thankful too for your time in joining us with today's session. We have left a good amount of time, we hope, for continued engagement. We're going to be sticking on for as long as they'll let us and for as long as you have questions, I hope, that we can answer. But I've included at least my contact information here as well, in case you have any follow-on questions that you want to share with us after today's presentation.
Thanks so much to Ben and to Debbie and ESMC for that presentation on what they are doing and enrollment specialists. They'll continue to be around throughout the duration of this session to answer any questions that you have over chat. And certainly when you finish up with this, please go back to the agenda, and our general session will begin at 3:15 Eastern this afternoon. So definitely encourage you to join that. And just thank you for joining NACD during this COVID virtual annual meeting in celebration of our 75th anniversary. Thank you.